Welcome to the inaugural session of Jana Institute's Zero Hour. Today, we're going to be talking about Afghanistan's most perilous hour. Economically, things are very dire within Afghanistan. There is a food crisis currently taking place. The World Bank, international institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF have also moved out. The foreign reserves of Afghanistan have also been frozen. We have with us today Fahd Humayun, who is a doctoral candidate at Yale University. He is a policy analyst and a researcher with a focus on political science, but with a particular, he takes a particular look at the South Asian region and this region at large. And we're glad to have you here, Fahd. Thank you for joining us today. First, we're going to start with the immediate challenges, the stakeholders and the structures. There is an entire government and there are immediate concerns such as the food crisis, such as what happens with women, and such as what happens with regards to security apparatus left behind by NATO and their allies. So while the World Bank and IMF and these other institutions have already left, the problem exists that that the Taliban now basically have to engage with the international community as well in order to make sure that their people survive this 1 year that is coming. How important has this engagement been so far, and how well have the Taliban done in engaging with the international community so far? And if there are any lags that exist, how can we circumvent them?
Thanks, Zahaid. I think you've described the situation in Afghanistan pretty comprehensively in your intro, which is that I think everybody recognizes that there are multiple crises that are playing out right now in Afghanistan. And there's a lot of uncertainty about the extent to which Afghanistan will be able to, I think, survive in the coming 6 months. And by survive, I'm talking particularly about the structure of the state and its institutions in the absence of outside and external support. Afghanistan for the past 20 years has been bankrolled largely by the international community, just in terms of the state being able to pay the salaries of civil servants, ensuring service delivery, ensuring the provision of food to the far reaches of the country. Now, suddenly, all of those questions are, all of those issues are open-ended questions because it's not clear whether that assistance is going to be forthcoming. So the United Nations has made an appeal and made it very clear, I think, that the enormity of the challenge is something which needs to be addressed head on. But in the absence of Afghanistan's former external partners such as countries in Western Europe, the United States, obviously, like you said, a lot of that aid a lot of that assistance has been sort of curtailed. It's unclear whether the Taliban government will be able to ensure the smooth sort of running of the day-to-day functions of the Afghan state.
Thank you for that, Fahd. Just to add to that, just one last question. Has there, in your experience, been... So we know that international organizations such as the World Bank and others have left, but there are many local and domestic civil society organizations that existed until the withdrawal unceremoniously took place. So is there any picture within the US and the Western partners as to what is to happen with regards to engagement with any CSO partners that they previously had very big, all-encompassing relationships with?
I think all of those relationships are now a function of the tone and tenor of the Western community's engagement with Afghanistan, more broadly speaking. I think if the West decides to support Afghanistan and support, the humanitarian effort on the ground, it's likely that it would rather choose to partner with civil society organizations and NGOs as opposed to sending money directly to the Taliban, where I think there will be big concerns about the extent to which that grants legitimacy to the Taliban. And I think we also need to sort of caveat this with the fact that the Taliban still haven't been recognized as the government of Afghanistan by any Western country so far. And so there's this big question about the extent to which the Western powers are perhaps hedging their bets, hoping that the Taliban, hoping to see whether the Taliban reform in a way that is amenable to the West as far as things like human rights, minority rights, the rights of women are concerned, and perhaps using that as leverage in exchange for some form of quasi recognition further down the road.
I'm glad that you brought up the promises made by the Afghan Taliban and the future and fate, so to speak, of rights and freedoms within the country, because this is a perfect segue on to our next question, which is regarding the interim government's promises and whether it's managed to uphold any so far. A particular cause of concern has been the fate of women and women's rights in Afghanistan. For instance, if you look at the last Afghan Taliban government that was there till 2001, and from 2001 till 2021, which is a space of 2 decades, the literacy rate for women, for girls, almost doubled in that time. And now suddenly you have a new government in place, which is stating that girls can go to elementary schools, but they can't. They do not have access to secondary schools and high schools under further notice. And just this Tuesday, they further confirmed this statement by saying that yes, we are working on providing high school access to women in Afghanistan, but this will come at a later stage. What this later stage is, we frankly do not know. And also another related point is that I also already mentioned that there has been two major announcements of government key ministers within the government, both deputy and senior levels, and none of those have any women. There was a women's affairs ministry within Afghanistan, which has now been replaced by the Ministry of Virtue and Vice. So this is where the debate on women's rights in Afghanistan currently stands. And with regards to that, my question for you would be, is it getting any better? Will the West get what it wants in terms of getting these promises fulfilled with regards to providing rights for women, minorities, and all other sections of the public?
Look, I think it's a complicated question because, as far as the structure of the Taliban cabinet goes, and we may see further evolutions in the coming weeks with the addition of more minority Tajik Hazara ministers. But I think it's very unlikely that we'll see the inclusion of women in the Afghan in the Taliban cabinet. I think the Afghan Taliban have made it pretty clear that they intend to govern Afghanistan the way they see fit and not by some Western yardstick. But having said that, I think the Afghan Taliban also recognize that this isn't the 90s and that women have played a key, crucial role in the last 20 years in the building of the Afghan state, in occupying key jobs. And so I think the Taliban are going to have to reckon with the fact that without women as part of the labor force and without women contributing to society, that's going to hurt Afghanistan, not just economically and in terms of socioeconomic development, but it'll hurt Afghanistan's ability to attract investment. It'll hurt Afghanistan's ability to attract the aid and assistance of international partners. So I think the Taliban that we're seeing today is definitely a more pragmatic Taliban. I'm actually a little surprised that they've been a little slow on the women's question, that they haven't moved. I expected them to actually move a little faster. We haven't really seen that kind of response. In fact, we've seen very sort of regressive statements on the roles that women can occupy and women's place in society. And that's, frankly speaking, very discouraging, given that a lot of the gains that women have made in the last 20 years are now at risk of reversal. And I think that's a key concern, not just for. Frankly speaking, I don't think this is just a Western concern. I think this is a concern as much for regional countries, because countries like Pakistan have, where the gender gap continues to be a problem, where women's rights continue to be curtailed. I think there is a very serious worry amongst the political classes in Pakistan about the extent to which what's happening in Afghanistan might possibly result in having a negative spillover effect in Pakistan, setting an unhealthy precedent about things like the patriarchy and the role of women in society. Specifically, if right-wing groups in Pakistan and in other countries, in Iran, decide to draw lessons from what the Taliban are doing in Afghanistan. So to my mind, I don't think this is just a Western concern. I think this is a universal concern, which is the future of women and Afghanistan's women. I think the foremost concern is that they are not at risk of just surviving, and they're not targeted for their gender. And beyond that, I think there are many layers of risk associated with the extent to which they're able to contribute meaningfully to Afghan society, the way they were doing these past few years.
Yeah, I think it's important that you mentioned regional players seeing the issue of women as one of the primary concerns with regards to the Afghan government. And it's something that Pakistan, both in government circles and beyond, in all sorts of policy circles and within the citizenry as well, there has been an expression of actually caring about what happens with regards to rights of women in Afghanistan. And it's important that we talk about this, because with regards to Pakistan, there are many concerns. One of them is, of course, that of refugees. What happens? Are there more refugees coming into Pakistan? Will there be an exodus of sorts of the way there was before? But beyond that, there's also, as you mentioned, the security concern, which is where localized groups such as the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan will see this as a way forward, as a plan, as a chalked out, demarcated plan for how to approach things in Pakistan. Obviously, it's not so simple, but you can already see that there have been statements made by the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan which show that they have been emboldened with this victory, so to speak, of the Afghan Taliban within Afghanistan. And just beyond that, there is also just this last weekend, we saw within the heart of the capital, the issue of Lal Masjid surfaced once more when you had Maulana Abdul Aziz hoist Afghan Taliban flag on Lal Masjid. So you can see that the extreme right is rearing its head over this problem, is seeing the Afghan interim government as a means of an opportunity, for instance, for countries such as Pakistan. So, with regards to Pakistan's concerns in these two spheres, particularly within security and extremism, but also resultantly within refugees, what sort of future do you see taking shape for Pakistan?
Again, it's an uncertain future. You spoke right now to some of the trends that we've seen since the Taliban have taken over power in Kabul. Some of the trends we've seen in Pakistan, particularly amongst right-wing groups. Frankly, I don't think any of that is surprising. This is what many people in Pakistan had predicted would happen. And again, I don't think this is just again, I think it's important to contextualize what else is happening in the region. Afghanistan is not the only country which has regressed in terms of its return to a more sort of theological orientation, and it's how it espouses the relationship between state and society. India's done this since 2014. So I think Pakistan is caught in a very difficult place where both to the east and to the west, religion is being used, and dogma is being used to provide a template for molding the behavior of citizens and recrafting the role and the function of the state. And that's, I think, a dangerous place to be in, especially if you're trying to make a push for things like pluralistic values and rights and freedoms. So I think this is a path which has to be tread very carefully. Pakistan at the moment is not doing too well in terms of things like protecting minority rights. It's not doing too well in terms of just making sure that individual freedoms are upheld and guarded and protected. And that's a daily struggle. And it's made even more complicated by the fact that you have these macro trends playing out in the region, which of course become they become these forces that domestic actors within your country are able to draw inspiration from. Pakistan has been fighting this war on terrorism and has been trying to fight a war on countering extremism. It goes back to the Peshawar school attack, but it predates that as well. And it's been for the most part, it's been I would say, a patchy performance. There are some things that Pakistan has been able to do better, such as pushing back against the TTP and pushing the TTP out to the out of its borders. But in terms of, I think, drawing a line in the sand and saying this is what the state stands for, and this is what we will not let right-wing groups infringe upon the sovereignty of the state and the constitutional rights of the state and its citizens. That's something which we've been perhaps less successful at. With for instance, the rise of the TLP is a symptom of that very difficult path that we've had to walk. So the extent to which groups like the TLP will draw inspiration from the Afghan Taliban and say, well, the Afghan Taliban have become a mainstream political actor. Now, that the TLP has been banned in Pakistan, but continues to function as under different names and will likely continue to be a very vibrant political force in parts of the country, particularly urban parts of the country. I think this is a serious question that the Pakistani state needs to grapple with, which is that the Afghan Taliban have found a way to mainstream themselves using violence as a tool. And wielding their sort of coercive power. What happens when right-wing groups in Pakistan feel like mainstream political parties in Pakistan aren't doing their job well, and decide to do something similar? So yes, I think this is an existential challenge that Pakistan has to deal with. And this is separate from the terrorism issue, the counter-terrorism issue, because this is in many ways woven into the social fabric of a society that still today grapples with the question of religion and the place of religion and nationalism in its political discourse. So it's I think the challenges are many in the days and weeks ahead, and I also think that's one of the reasons why Pakistan has. And I think it's perhaps for the best that Pakistan hasn't come out the way it came out in the 90s, saying that we're going to support the Taliban and we recognize the Taliban government, because Pakistan has learned over the course of generations how that sort of played out, and the extent to which Pakistan then had to live with the reputational baggage of being the only conduit to a Taliban government that was, for the most part, an international pariah. I don't think Pakistan wants to repeat of that scenario. And I think Pakistan also recognizes the fact that this is a Taliban government which is going to be less easy to engage with. So there are already signs that the Taliban aren't going to be playing ball. The fact that they continue to tolerate the presence of the TTP on Afghan soil, the fact that the Afghan Taliban have, as predicted, said that we're not going to recognize the international border as the demarcation between the two countries. They continue to call it the Durand Line. And according to anecdotal reports, they've also instructed local field commanders to start removing the fences along part of the border. So the implications that this has for, say, irredentism, more broadly speaking, for ethno-nationalism, for the uncontrolled flow of people and goods, including contraband and weapons, and the TTP, which we know has the ability to launch kinetic attacks in Pakistan cities from bases in Afghanistan. All of this poses a national security risk to Pakistan.
Thank you for that, Fahad. So today's conversation in a nutshell is not one that is the most optimistic, of course, because of the many questions that hang in the balance for both Pakistan and Afghanistan. Predominantly among them, of course, as Fahad quite concisely pointed out, are the dual questions of counterterrorism and extremism within the social fabric of Pakistan, and how we must fight these both together at the same time and not conflate the two either, because they're both two very separate issues that are often seen with the same lens. But beyond this, we've also discussed on the lessons that both Pakistan and the Afghan Taliban have learned over the course of the last 2 decades. Pakistan, on its part, has learned that perhaps just simply recognizing the Afghan Taliban government is not going to be a possibility immediately off the bat, because as far as its own interests go, it is in Pakistan's interest to make sure that women are adequately represented within the Afghan setup, that minorities are adequately represented as well. We saw this even with the recent statements of state institutions and Pakistan's Prime Minister as well, who mentioned at the SCO conference that he was going to be speaking to the Taliban government to ask for a more inclusive setup. But beyond this, there are urgent questions that Afghanistan's government has to answer. One of them is, of course, the lingering question of what happens with women and why their rights and freedoms that they guaranteed with the promises that they gave to the West and other partners, why those promises have not been fulfilled so far. There's also the question of how and when women make up half of the segment of the population, they're supposed to be included in the overall social fabric of the country. How trade will take place without a significant portion of the working population not being included. But lastly, and most importantly, perhaps we've understood the fact that the Afghan Taliban cannot simply work within the setup that they have created, and perhaps they realize this too, but that Western partners are waiting on some sort of compromise and on some sort of delivery on the promises that they had guaranteed with regards to the preservation of rights. So once that happens, the many lingering questions of what happens to the state structures within Afghanistan, how to avert the food crisis within Afghanistan, and how to prevent all sorts of other issues that are consistently becoming more pronounced within the country, they are alleviated. With that, I'd like to thank you, Fahad, for taking out the time today. It was a great conversation. We'd like to have you. We'd like to have you again soon as well, hopefully. And yes, thank you for watching this. Oh, and also do like and subscribe this, Fahad. This goes for you and for our audience as well, to the Jinnah Institute YouTube page. Thank you.